Good afternoon, everyone. It's Dr. Sam Hurst, and this is the 25th in our series of the October Gothic A Day Tempts the Vampire to Stay. And this is one of those days where that title is particularly apt. As usual, I'm going to be introducing a text, giving you some context, giving you some plot points, why I think it's important, and also giving you some reading recommendations. Now, we're moving into the end of the 19th century and what is often thought of as the fin de siècle at the moment. We've had a look in the Victorian period at the novels of sensation, also at the ghost story, and of those early Bronte novels as well. But now we're moving into that fin de siècle period and some of the most famous Gothic novels of all time. Often nowadays, when we think of the Gothic, we often associate it with the Victorian. Now that ignores all of the 18th century stuff I've been talking about, but is probably rooted in the fact that some of the works that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days are some of the most famous, most popular, most well-known, and most adapted of the Gothic works. Now, if you haven't already guessed what the book is today, it is, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, this was published in 1897, and I'm going to start with some reading recommendations by way of a sort of history and contextualization of the vampire. We've already thought about the early vampire by looking at John Polidori's The Vampire from 1819. And throughout the Victorian period, the vampire, and particularly the aristocratic vampire, continued to be a popular figure. If you're wanting to get into and understand this development of the vampire, a great place to start is this absolute chonker of a book, Varney the Vampire, usually attributed to James Malcolm Rymer. Now, as you can see, it's not a small project to get started, but this started or was published as a series of penny dreadfuls over a couple of years in the 1840s. And it is a very lengthy, very involved, multi-plotted story. A great adventure, but you will be reading for a while. Now, one of the other most famous vampire works of the Victorian period is one that we've already mentioned. In fact, it's by the author we talked about yesterday, Sheridan Le Fanu, and his short story of Carmilla, which is, of course, one of the most famous of the lesbian vampires. If you're interested in Dracula and wanting to read more about Bram Stoker's work, and particularly those with a hint of the vampiric, then you can read his last novel, The Lair of the White Worm. And if we're thinking about the influence of Dracula, the influence of the vampire and where it goes next, a good place to start going into the 20th century is from the Witch of Prague collection, but the story itself that you're interested in by Marion Crawford, F. Marion Crawford, is For the Blood is the Life, a title which should be recognisable as one borrowed from Dracula. Now, let's have a go over this story. Everybody's fairly familiar with it, but usually when you read it, you'll come across many of its plot points as a surprise. Of course, you'll know about Jonathan Harker going to Transylvania as a lawyer, trying to sort out some property in England for the Count. He gets there, he sends a lot of recipes home, and he ends up stuck in this castle, surrounded by threat, seeing strange sights, hearing howls in the night. Then, of course, we have Dracula invading England, using technology to do so and the modern kind of systems of, for example, house possession, and using his accumulated knowledge. We see him first entering in Whitby, which is why Whitby is so often associated with Goths. And then we see him, of course, first turning Lucy Westenra, and then becoming pursued by that team of light as they avenge Lucy's death and also stop him from taking Mina from them. Now, that's a very brief overview, but there's lots of things that you might not remember. You might remember Renfield, Dracula's servant, but perhaps not all the emphasis on the life in the asylum. You might remember Dracula coming to England, but less of the details on property law. You might remember the fact that there's a team that goes after him, but many of the productions and adaptations miss one of my favourite characters out, the American Quincy. You might also remember this idea of pursuit, but forget how important train timetables are to that pursuit. Dracula is not just producing another vampire. Of course, every vampire narrative explores specific concerns, and there's a lot of critical work on Dracula and whether we can see it as sort of fears of reverse colonization, also fears of the foreign other, and also representing both the possibilities and anxieties of the period in terms of the technology, in terms of the changing world, and also in terms of the changing nature of women. Can Mina be read, for example, as a new woman? Or is Lucy the dangerous side of the new woman? With all of her boyfriends and all of her lust for life? Perhaps difficult to say, but I recommend reading it and engaging with those problems and questions. It's a really fun read, actually, and quite a wild ride. So I do recommend and do enjoy. Bye.